So this lecture is on Unit 6, the interdependence of ecosystems. Here are the main ideas that we will be covering in this section. So you can refer to this as the main list of topics. So a quick review. So far in semester 1, we've covered essentially these topics right here, going from atoms, molecules to cells, how cells will then make up tissue, which then makes up organs, organ system to organism. So that was all in semester 1. I know we didn't really stress too much about organ system and organisms, but we'll be sprinkling that in. We sprinkled it in the first semester, and then we're going to be coming back to talk more about it in quarter 4. In quarter 3, we're really going to be zooming out of this level. Instead of looking at a nitty-gritty detail as we had here, we're going to be looking out here, zooming all the way out to the world, right? So the world is biosphere, and then we're going to talk really mostly in Unit 6 about ecosystem as well as community, and then Unit 7 and 8 will be going into the population sections, okay? So in 113, workbook 113, the topic is the components of an ecosystem, and this is to help frame the key ideas or key terms and introduce to you what the major parts of an ecosystem is. Okay, so again, the major parts, here are some key ideas here. Major parts are going to be a key term that we'll come back to talk about later is a biome. A biome is a large area. It's not just a city or a county, but a region that has ecosystems. So there could be multiple ecosystems within a biome. An example of a biome would be like the polar region or the tundra. And then you have like a rainforest, uh, you know, and then you have the savanna or the grassland. That would be another biome. Biomes are going to be affected by weather patterns as well as where they are located, the latitudinally, like where they are on the earth, okay? How far they are away from the sun, how much sunlight they get, how much rain they get. Ecosystem is the main focus for this particular unit. So it's going to be, ecosystem is made up of all living things. So I'm going to highlight that because that's a key topic. All living things as well as all the physical things. So here are some key terms for you. You need to know what a biotic factor is and an abiotic factor is. Okay, so those are going to be the ones you kind of define in the 113 activity. Here's more details to help you kind of wrap your head around it. Biotic factors are going to be your living organisms. So it can be anything from competitors, symbiont, we'll talk more about that later, but they refer to organisms that do symbiosis. They live together, closely together. Predators, you know what those are. Parasites, you probably know what those are, but we'll clarify what these mean. Pathogens are going to be disease-causing organisms. So things like bacteria, for example, and viruses, I guess. You could put them in that category as well. Abiotic factors make up the physical environment, okay? So these are going to be all the different things that make up what a location looks like the atmosphere, the amount of nutrients in the soil, what is the water, is there enough water, what is the pH of the water, all of those things. Wind speed, wind direction, velocity, all of those things have to do with creating kind of the weather and the climate for that location, for that ecosystem. Habitat and tolerance range in 114. So I want to clarify the word habitat. So one way to think about habitat is that it's just a home. It's where an organism lives. Okay. So they can have many different types of home, but pick the one that where they're currently living. Right. For example, in this frog is going to be living in this fresh water. Maybe that's a pond. Okay. Lichen can be found on roots and rocks and trees and bare ground. So that would be its habitat. We want to make sure that you understand the difference between a habitat and a niche. So I'm going to talk about that in a little bit later because you can easily get that confused. Okay, tolerance range is basically to explain how well, what is the likelihood that the organism can thrive in that environment. So some organisms have a very narrow tolerance range, meaning that instead of this nice wide curve, they have a very, I'm gonna just draw it in here. They have a very, very narrow curve like that. And that would be something like coral, for example, like we talked about and we saw it in the Chasing Coral movie, that, if the pH changes a little bit, the temperature changes a little bit, the coral will die, right? And that's why we're seeing coral bleaching events happening all around the world because they have a narrow tolerance range. We, on the other hand, as humans, so I'm going to label this as coral, and I'm going to use the example that this is human, this moss green color hilled here. So we have a very wide tolerance range. I mean, we have people living in the Sahara Desert. We have people living in the North Pole, like near the North Pole, like the Eskimos and the people who live in Siberia, northern part of Siberia and Russia. So they can tolerate those conditions, right? They have adapted and learned to live in those kind of climate. So, so you can see that they have a very broad range. Things that can affect the tolerance range has to do with abiotic factors, right? And amount of resources that are available. So we'll come back and revisit this topic in a little bit later. Okay, so 115 is going to go over niche. So this is a term that I talked about or mentioned a couple of slides before this one. And niche has to do with not only habitat, but it also includes the role that the organism plays in the environment, including its adaptation. Okay, so I'll give you some examples here, or I'll kind of walk you through this. Okay, so like for the picture that's shown here is a couple of vultures, probably living in the African savanna because you can see the carcasses of the zebras here. So the habitat would be the African savanna. And at adaptation, you can see here that it has sharp beaks, sharp claws, right? And it's able to then tear off all of the flesh off of the zebra carcass. The activity pattern that may not be clearly like, you might not know about this, but you may have to, study it a little bit. But, vultures are scavengers, right? So they are gonna be, they don't hunt zebra, but let's say the lion kills a zebra and, eat its fill, and then they leave the zebra carcass, and that's when the vulture would then come in. So that activity pattern, that adaptation, the way that they would come in and scavenge on the carcass, that would be part of its niche. It's like it's a cleanup crew, right? And so the physical condition, it's a very dry, arid climate, all of that. So how it interacts with other organisms, all of these things make up the niche. Okay, we'll be practicing it in class as well. The fundamental niche is essentially what the ideal conditions would be. What kind of if everything was in an idealized world, what kind of role and where would that organism be? What kind, realized would be the actual what actually happens in the real life. So usually a realized niche is going to be much narrower than the fundamental niche. So for example, here is a bunch of barnacles. You can find them on rocks around the pier or on tide pools. They also can live on the whale. So their fundamental niche can be very, very large, like very broad. But the realized niche of this particular group of barnacles is that this is living on the tide pools of the coast of um, Northern California, right? So that realized niche. And this one doesn't interact at all with whales because they're living on the coast or on the tide pool. And so that is a much narrower explanation or description than what available to do, what it's able to do. Okay, then we go into dingo habitat. So the habitat, so this is just the book's way of expanding on and providing example on some of the concepts we've talked about already. So dingoes, if you don't know what they are, they're pictured here. There's a video here that I've linked up on Canvas for you. Dingo is a highly adaptable species in Australia, and they can live all over in many different types of ecosystem, in many types of climate. And we'll come back and revisit that later in the case studies. But they can live in tropical rainforests as well as very dry desert in central Australia. Okay, so their habitats is very large, right? So they have a wide tolerance range. Okay, then now we're going to talk about population density, and this is going to be relating to the topics we'll be covering in the mealworm lab. So before we get into that, I want to make sure you guys know this term. The definition of population is all the organisms of the same species living in the same area. So for example, this is a tiger. It looks from the way the stripes look, I'm not quite too sure, but I'm going to take a guess that this is a Bengal tiger that lives in India, and that's going to be different than the Sumatran tigers that live in Indonesia or Southeast Asia, right? So though they're different, they're going to be different species. So this particular tiger is going to be different than the Sumatran tiger, and so that would be a different population. Okay, then we're going to talk about population density. Population density is a number of organisms in a particular area. So if you're talking about land organism, you're going to be looking at 2D. So just the area. But if you're looking at marine or aquatic organism, you're going to look at the volume. Okay. So organisms that have low population density, meaning there's a lot of space in between them, are going to be the ones that are territorial, usually going to be predators, right? Solitary, like they don't like to hang out with anybody, they're loners. High population density are going to be the ones that are going to be close together. So examples are like coral here, or fish, or rabbit. They kind of grow, they thrive on being together, like ants and stuff. They have colonies. So anything that can make colonies will be high density. Okay, so here is a preface or introduction, quick introduction and good graphic to show you all the three different types of population distribution that you'll need to know for this unit. And I'll go into them in more detail in the next few slides. But essentially, clumped is just like the picture shows. They're clumped together, clustered. and that has to do with the distribution of resources. So most of the time, clumped is going to be like something like this. And the example would be a school of fish where they're going to be clumped together like that. Okay. Random are going to have unpredictable distribution. So they're kind of scattered all over. So here's an example shown of the wild flowers in California, okay, on the hills of the Anza Borrego Desert. Then uniform, you can see how they're kind of evenly spaced out. That is shown by the penguins here. And so they're competing for scarce environmental resources. Okay, going into a little bit more detail here. Population distribution essentially tell us how the organisms are spaced out. And that could be useful because you can track changes over time, right? Like if you notice that it's more densely populated a certain year, and you come back 10 years later and you count the organism and there's less. So you notice there's a difference. You'll probably want to ask why, right? So it's a way that population biologists can study patterns in organisms and populations. Okay, here are the three different types again. So this is random. So random, it's not very common, and it's because this is hard to achieve, that the environment's uniform, resources are equally available throughout the year. There's no interaction between individuals, or interactions produce no pattern of avoidance or attraction. So that's really hard to achieve. So a lot of times random population or random distribution will tend to be plants and some insects. Yeah. Okay, uniform is a little bit more common, but still not that common because you also rely on a homogeneous environment, meaning they're going to be the same all throughout. And a lot of times, especially for plants, competition for roots and space will allow for them to, like, because there's a plant here, there's no plants in that area because it's going to outcompete each other. Some plants will have this ability to produce chemicals to prevent other plants from growing near them. So an example of that would be this cacti. Okay, they have a uniform distribution. Another one that is man-made, that's uniform distribution, would be if you ever go to an orchard, either of like, you know, oranges is the one that comes to mind for me. If you've ever gone to an orange orchard, then you'll see that they grow the oranges in nice, neat rows like this. Apple trees are the same in apple farm, just because it's evenly spaced out and the farmers did it that way. Okay, clumped. Clumped is when individuals are clustered together, and usually that's because they're relying on their peers to help them, like to protect each other, basically. So, like meerkats, for example, ants and termites tend to be in colonies because they're either feeding on that resource, the social behavior, there's amount of food, water, shelter that they are all relying on or sharing together, right? So this is one of the more common occurring distribution pattern in nature.